Hi, my name is Jazper Lu, the local national news editor here at the Chronicle. I'm honored to be joined today by Courtney Geels, the Republican nominee for Congress in North Carolina's 4th District. She is seeking to replace Representative David Price, who is retiring. North Carolina's 4th District includes Durham County, Orange County, Person County, Granville County, Alamance County, and parts of Caswell County. This means that if she wins, she'll be representing the Duke students, faculty, and staff that reside here in Durham. Geels grew up in Hillsborough, North Carolina, and is a nurse with over 10 years of experience in emergency and trauma medicine, and holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in nursing from Bob Jones University. This is her first time running for elected office. So Geels, thank you for joining us today, and welcome.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So just to start off, what motivated you to pursue a seat in Congress?
Yeah, I was really just watching kind of an observation from my own point of view as a nurse in the hospital. I was seeing this dramatic change in prioritizing from when I started nursing. So I graduated in 2012 from nursing school. So just watching over the past 10 years of just seeing this prioritization more on money and profits. And really, I would call it bad data analytics, really seeing these high-level CEOs, CMOs, CNO level people making decisions that they were so far removed from at the bedside, and really never coming down to ask questions and find out where can we cut costs that actually helps your job, but eliminates waste. I never really saw that, and the longer I've been in nursing, the more I've seen where there's this separation, the people making decisions and the people doing the job. And my husband was saying the same thing about in the CPA world, these large companies that you have these high-level partners that are selling to large companies who think they're getting these great quality audits, but really the larger the company, really the people who are doing the audits are right out of school. And so you're getting this, I would call it a decreased quality product, and for me it was decreased quality care in the hospital, because the decisions that were being made that were affecting our jobs were made from people who are very withdrawn from the actual work themselves. And what I've seen in our federal government is, again, this kind of same pattern of a lot of power that's moved federally from the states when we really want to see decentralizing power just based on the way the Constitution is written, so that the people have more voice, so that the people that are elected locally and at a state level are really the ones making a lot more decisions that directly affect us. But what I've seen in the past few years with both recent administrations, Trump and Biden, I see a lot of executive orders, a lot of roller coaster effect that from executive orders, really seeing how one person undoes the decisions made by the last president. And so we see a lot of changes that directly affect us, and I think that we need to decrease the power of the federal government and really bring power to the states and the people, so that the people who are representing the people are closer to them and can really figure out what they need and advocate for those things.
Okay. So if you're elected to Congress, what would be your top 3 legislative priorities that you would focus on?
Sure. Well, the number one thing I've already touched on, I want to stop executive orders from the federal level, legislatively, whether that's a constitutional amendment or just a type of legislation, just to make sure that the people who are making law are the legislators. But as far as subject-wise, I want to push for parent choice in education, and sometimes I get some pushback related to that because people think, oh, you're trying to defund the public education, and I don't want to do that. I actually want to bring people back to public education. I grew up in the public schools in Orange County. I graduated from Orange High School. I always thought I'd put my child in public education, but we see really decreasing testing scores, specifically even in the counties that we spend more money. So in my district, Durham gets the most money per child. It's about $18,000 between the county, the state, and the federal level funds, and whereas Orange County, say, gets about $15,000 on average. So we're spending $3,000 more per child, which is a lot of money throughout a whole county, but we actually have worse testing scores in Durham. And so adding more money doesn't really seem to be solving the problem. And so really my idea would be creating more of a free market in education. So I'd really like to see the money follow the child. And some people who want this parent choice system, they're like, oh, just do a tax deduction. But I think that disenfranchises the lower income children. So I want every single child to have the same access to a quality education as any other child, no matter the income level. So I'd like to see from the federal level, if a certain amount of money, usually the money does not follow the child from the federal level, it's given in certain chunks for certain purposes. But if it's an average of, say, $2,000 per child, that money should come to the parent in the form of a voucher, and then be tied not only to that, but also say no money is going to come to the state level unless the state system also matches the voucher system, so that parent has that full voucher to be able to send their child to public, private, charter, or homeschool. And I think what you'll actually see in that system is you'll see so many more schools pop up. Churches will start schools. Small homeschooling groups will just start a small school where a couple parents that maybe have been out of teaching for a while come back to teaching. So we'll see an increase in teachers. I would say teachers will be a lot happier because they'll get paid more naturally, because if you actually calculate those numbers, you can pay teachers a lot more money than they're getting paid right now. I feel like we're losing a lot of money in the system somewhere, because spending $18,000 per child in Durham and teachers making not a lot of money. We're actually, I think, 30-something in the nation for paying teachers in North Carolina. I want to increase teacher pay. I want teachers to be happier, have less regulation, have more choice in where they want to teach, the children to have a more tailored education for them, parents to have a voice in their children's education. I think it's actually a great system for everyone, but it actually makes the government not have as many decisions in that education process, which is where I think I'll actually get the pushback, because it will bring power directly down to the people. And that's my whole goal, but I won't spend all my time on education. But I would like to push for quality medical care by reforming Medicaid and Medicare to make sure people have quality health care and we have access to health care with every person. And that's going to take a lot of digging and a lot of getting into the weeds of the way our system already works, and making sure that people have that quality health care, and that those lower income people have ways to get that quality health care and preventative care. And then just finally with the economy, I think that's what's on most people's minds. It polls the highest, and I hear that the most of, we're going to the gas pump and we're going to the grocery store and we're going out to eat, and we're seeing almost double the prices that we did a few years ago. Inflation is continuing to go up, and what I've been discussing with people lately is with gas prices, they fluctuate, but with inflation, you really never see prices come back down. So kind of where we are right now is where we're going to be, and we need to let the market and pay catch up to that so that people aren't struggling so much. And so slowing the spending down federally, because that's what's driving a lot of it, and making a budget and making sure we stick to that budget and working down that debt rather than increasing the debt.
Okay. Do you think there are any big issues that are impacting North Carolina specifically, and what would you do to address those?
Yeah, I think one subject that I hear a lot about is crime, and I think that's just this trend for, police have had a really hard time in the past few years, this movement to defund the police. The people that are affected mostly by crime is, we know that Durham, out of all the counties, has the most crime. And the people that are affected the most by crime don't want to defund police. But we already defunded it some, I think, during that movement a couple years ago. But also just the morale of the police force. People don't want to become police officers, or they leave the police force, and they're begging people to come in. And when you have to beg people to come be a police officer, you're not really getting the best person for the job. You're not going through 5 candidates and picking the best one. You're taking the one that meets the minimum requirement, which is against all of what we were trying to do. And so I think working on funding the safety and security of Americans, that's with the border, that's locally, that's internationally. I want to make sure that we're prioritizing safety for everyone.
Okay. So one of the top issues that will decide people's vote here in the Duke community, at least, is abortion, especially given the overturning of Roe v. Wade a few months ago. So what is your stance on abortion, and what will you do in Congress to address this issue?
Yeah, I'm pro-life. I'm pretty obvious about that when you look on my website. But again, I stick to what I'm running for. I'm running because I want to make sure people have a voice, and we're bringing power from the federal level as close to the people level as we can get it. And so I really want to stick to the Constitution as much as possible, and the roles that are given to the federal government are given to the federal government, and anything else is given to the states. And so Roe v. Wade just overturned it being at the federal level, and it gives the power back to the states. And so I do not have any sort of plan or motivation to legislate anything related to abortion at the federal level.
If a federal abortion ban came to your desk in Congress, would you support it?
I would have to vote pro-life, but there are certain situations that I would have to make sure were in that bill that I think helps being a nurse and being a Republican and being able to actually talk to Republicans and explain to them these situations that a lot of them don't really know about. Specifically, one would be ectopic pregnancy. That's something that, unless you're medical, you don't usually know what it is, but that means that you have a baby, you have the sperm and the egg come together, you call it zygote, whatever you want to call it. It has implanted not in the uterus. Usually it's the fallopian tube, but it's a non-viable pregnancy, and it is a medical emergency. So the baby's going to die and the mom is going to die. And so I always make it very clear that certain situations like that, and I actually recently had a nurse reach out to me on my website, and we were talking about this really cordially. You could tell she works in OBGYN area of Duke, and we were talking a lot about all these Duke gets a lot of the weird cases in general. Like people come all across America for issues at Duke that are really odd. And so she has dealt with a lot of very, what I would call odd cases that relate to the life of the mother and really even viability of the baby. And so I would want to make sure that if there were a bill on the table that, by the way, I would not be bringing forth, but would have to choose to vote on that I would definitely advocate for making sure that things were in the bill that put exceptions in there that we do protect the life of the mother as well.
Would your ideal abortion law also make exceptions for rape and incest?
I have told people that my personal beliefs don't include that, but I would be happy to sign a bill that has that in there. But if you look at our current congressmen and women in Congress right now, on both sides of the aisle, there was a recent federal bill. It was after the leak for Roe v. Wade, before it was overturned, but around that time of the leak, there was a bill that was voted on that allowed, it was really trying to codify abortion up until 40 weeks. So that means fully developed baby could be terminated. And that is the direction that the Democrat Party is going. And it's putting that pro-choice all the way up until that baby takes its first breath. And that's actually the definition that a lot of people are going toward when it comes to abortion. And so I personally would be happy to sign a bill that gives exception to the mother's life, incest, and rape. But unfortunately, the current Democrat Party is not moving that direction. I don't think you'd find one or two current congressmen and women who would vote that way.
So what would you say to the many Duke students here that feel that their reproductive rights are under attack?
I think that that's an interesting term that's been added to that, because actually abortion can really harm reproductive systems of women. There's a lot of women who don't know that. They'll have multiple abortions and then say they'll get married a few years later and want to have a baby, and then they have trouble having a baby because their physical organs have been damaged. And so I don't think there's a lot of education out there for what it actually does to a woman's body. I think it's a really hard issue. It's a really sad issue, and it's something that the woman's dealing with, something that's really hard, and it's been turned into this political topic that's really heartbreaking for all people involved with it. And so it's something that I'm very careful with, and I'm very empathetic to what people are going through. But when I say I'm pro-life, I really want people to know I'm pro-life in every single circumstance, because a lot of people think a lot of people think that Republicans only care about that baby while it's in the womb. I hear that a lot, and that's just not true about me. I want to make sure that children are taken care of, that adoption is easy access, that children have great education, that they have access to community college, that we're helping children who don't have a family that's taking care of them, that we're helping elderly, because we're actually moving toward a system where we're kind of pushing euthanasia for elderly people. If there's this low quality of life, we're going to euthanize them. There is a movement, and the pro-choice movement, and it's not just about the women's reproductive rights at this point. We're really moving toward a culture where life in its definition is not valued, and I value it at every stage, and I want life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for every single individual.
Okay. We can move on to a new topic.
Sure.
I know it's a big
it's
one,
a hard topic,
yeah.
and a hot topic, really.
So as of August 2022, housing prices here in Durham have gone up around 13.6%, give or take, making affordable housing really hard to find, even for college students and workers here at Duke. So what do you think Congress should do to address affordable housing, if anything?
Yeah, I was actually talking to somebody about this during the primary at the polls, and I never even knew. This is where I think having representatives that are willing to listen is so crucial, because I have learned so much from talking to Democrats about really what people mean when they say some of these, I would call them buzz terms, like affordable housing. I think a lot of Republicans don't realize that affordable housing, when people are talking about, a lot of times they're talking about wanting to buy a house, like not ever being able to afford to be able to buy a house. And so I was learning this, we were talking at the polls, and I was listening for a while, and eventually I'm like, okay, I like to get things done, modeling this, how do we actually legislate this or provide this, and it work, economically too. And so I kind of have this thought process, and I would like to help solve some problems, and I think these are small movements, because even if you build 100 houses and you get people in them, that's not that many people that you're helping house. But I do think that when you think about the federal level's access to capital and how they can put money in, I always talk about investing as far as how can the federal level spend money and then see that money kind of come back. And that's in every way. If we want to spend money on education and incentivize people to go into nursing and teaching because we have shortages there, like do we pay for education so that they can come back and work in the workforce, and those kind of modeling where we're really seeing people kind of come back and give back, and we see more economic growth from that. So I think when it comes to housing, that builds wealth with people that are having trouble building wealth. And so I think if we have a model where, say, the government does buy plots of land and builds houses, small 2 or 3 bedroom houses, and sells them for a capped price at somebody who has to make a minimum, or a maximum level of income where they can they have decent credit. We're hard workers. They just don't make a ton of money. And I think we could have a certain situation set up where if they can get the loan from the bank, that the government would be the ones building the house and having it ready and selling at a lower cost so that they can actually purchase that house. And then that money is just being paid back. So it's like you put up the money at the beginning, the federal government would, and then you see the individual people being able to buy those houses at a lower cost and then start building wealth from that.
Cool. So another topic that is impacting Durham is gun violence. So gun violence has been on the rise in Durham over the past few years. It's also been a prominent issue throughout the country given the school shootings that have happened. So do you support or oppose quote-unquote common sense gun restrictions like restricting permitless carry, restrictions on the sale of semi-automatic weapons, or expanded background checks for private sellers?
Yeah, so the background checks, I might be more open to background check type stuff. Being a nurse, I look a lot at this from a mental health perspective. We have mean people doing mean things, and you're not going to really stop them from doing those mean things. But a lot of these situations, especially that have gotten national attention, have had a lot of mental health issues, have had there was one gentleman that came in and killed his orthopedic surgeon because he was in out of control pain, and I would argue that's not an excusable reason to kill somebody, but you also are irrational when you have extreme pain. And so most people know that when you're in a lot of pain, you're not thinking critically, you're not thinking like you normally would if that pain were to go away. And so I look at that from a medical perspective and think, I know there is this hesitancy to give narcotics right now. It's a huge problem, and I think that comes from a border issue. They all start connecting. I'm talking about a lot of different issues right now. But when I look at mental health care, we don't have funding for acute, chronic, or preventative care. Most people who are struggling with mental health problems do not have the funds to be able to pay for it and don't have insurance. So I look at that as a security and safety issue, and that is a role of the federal government. And so I look at spending some money on helping mental health care so that we're preventing a lot of these people that aren't the people that are just bad guys wanting to do bad things, as people would maybe call it. I think that cuts out a lot of it. If you look at these states and cities that do have what you would call common sense gun laws, or more what I would call infringement of the Second Amendment, you actually have worse gun violence. So it's not helping any situation. If you look at the statistics, it's not helping by having that legislation. And you could argue that it's harming some people that aren't able to defend themselves with the red flag laws. There's women who the man says, oh, she's crazy, and gets this, paperwork where she can't get a gun, and then he goes and kills her and she can't defend herself. There's these situations that don't go well for anybody. And when I look at the Second Amendment specifically, it says the right to bear arms shall not be infringed to secure, I think it's the word secure, a free state. I forget the word in there, but it's really the whole point is, again, to prevent tyrannical government, which is my whole goal, is to decrease the power of the federal level. And anyone you talk to that's coming from any type of communist country or centralized power, they usually do not allow citizens to have guns. And so I've asked a ton of international people and said, what do you like about America, or what do you see significantly different about America and our government? Is they say you have guns, and they say it in a positive way. And so we have to be very careful not to infringe the Second Amendment when we're talking about these gun laws. But I do think that when you talk about common sense, there are psychiatric needs. And I was asked this recently, and again, it might be a little bit unpopular, but it's reality, is that so going back to my ER background, if somebody comes in and either has suicidal ideation or homicidal ideation, they want to hurt somebody else, either of those where they might be a threat to themselves or somebody else, and that might just even be like a schizophrenic break or something like that, you get put on an involuntary commitment. That's in North Carolina, IVC. It's different in every state how they call that, but it's holding somebody and they actually lose their rights. It's a judicial process. So I think when we talk about legislation, we need to look at kind of that process and look at mental health and say, we're not going to take away your right to own a gun, but we may take your right to be like a citizen for mental health evaluation. And that might be more the direction that I would go. And that can get kind of scary too, because then you have people, complaining about people that don't have issues. But a doctor, a psychiatrist is going to be able to evaluate that and then decide, do we keep them on this IVC, or do we, allow them to go about their business and have their rights restored?
Okay, well, another big issue that is more specific to Duke is, the affordability of education, specifically higher education. We see a lot of people taking on hundreds of thousands even on student loan debt.
Mm-hmm.
So do you support canceling student loan debt or reforming that in any way?
I don't, because debt you've purchased a product. So whether it's your education or it's your TV, you've purchased a product. You knew going in that was the tuition, and I had student loan debt. It wasn't $200,000, but I also knew how much my college education was going to cost. I didn't even apply to Duke. I was really smart in high school. People asked me, did you apply to, I know Duke and UNC are ultimate rivals. I grew up in Hillsborough, I understand. But like, I didn't even apply to those schools, even though I probably could have, I know I could have gotten into UNC, would have gotten into Duke, but I chose to go to a Christian private school in South Carolina that anyone can get into. But I knew how much Duke cost. At the time, it was about $60,000 a year. I don't know what it is now. You would know.
Higher,
it's higher now.
It's higher.
But you look at, like, I wonder, and I've actually been talking about this in the past couple weeks, like, how do you solve some of these problems? And why are we charging this insane amount of money for an education? Mm-hmm. But I don't think it looks at, like, do we forgive debt that somebody chose to inquire about? Because they've chosen to do that. That's like, I went and made a purchase, and then I want to tell the government, like, hey, I shouldn't have to pay back for this purchase. You are purchasing an education. And so I don't agree with canceling debt. But I do look at why is it so high. And I wonder if the reason it's so high is because the federal government is willing to give out these giant loans. And I think if schools knew that students didn't have this access to that high capital, mm-hmm. would they even charge that much anymore? And so I'd actually want to look at why is it that I would actually say colleges are taking advantage of students. It's not the government. I think the colleges are actually doing that. Mm-hmm. And it's because if you're running a business, a school's a business too. If you're running a business and you think, hey, we can charge $200,000 a year, like they might decide to start doing that. Yeah. With inflation especially. So if they decide that and people are able to access that much of a loan, well, now you're in debt for $800,000 with a bachelor's degree. Mm-hmm. And that's because the school knows they can get that capital from the government. Mm-hmm. And now we're stuck, if we're going to school with that kind of debt. And it really is actually the price that the university is setting. So I'd like to look at what's making the universities think that they can charge that much.
Thank you for that. I wanted to move into broader issues on the national scale. So I want to start off with elections. So what do you think of allegations of widespread voter fraud, like the kind former President Donald Trump alleged in 2020? Mm-hmm. And what should be done about that?
Well, I first of all always like to point out that with elections, I think that is, again, the role of the states. It is not something the federal government should be involved in. So as I'm running for a federal office, it's not something that I plan to engage in legislatively whatsoever. Mm-hmm. Specifically with that subject, I mean, there is... my husband was involved in one of the lawsuits in Georgia. I mean, that's pretty publicly available data. And so he is a data analyst by trade. He was studying the voter registration data in Georgia. And he found about 100,000 votes. It's very objective. I'm happy to show anybody that report that are either blatantly illegal per Georgia law or irregular enough that they just literally don't make sense. Like you can't receive and accept a ballot before it's ever mailed out, that kind of stuff. So he calls them controls. So when we look at elections, I think what's been interesting about this whole topic, now I also like to clarify, January 6th was illegal. It should have never happened. It was horrific, and I do not support any activity that was there. Mm-hmm. Regarding the actual subject of election integrity, I think what's been interestingly manipulated about that subject is Republicans have gotten this name that we want to like disenfranchise the vote or something, or prevent people from voting, or it's none of that. It's really, to me, it's a bipartisan issue. It's people were complaining about, they thought Russia was involved in 2016 when Trump won. I mean, there was and it went on the whole time he was president. It's going on the whole time Biden's president too. So I think every single voter wants to make sure that there's no interference with an election and that the people are electing their government officials. And that is what I want. I want to make sure that every person feels like they can vote and their vote counts. And so that's really my goal when it comes to like whatever I would be talking about. Mm-hmm. But again, legislatively, I think that needs to stay in the state's hands.
So do you think there's widespread voter fraud in North Carolina, or at least any
I actually think in studying the subject, there's probably been widespread voter fraud for years. And it's not like, mm-hmm. it's not just 2020. I think both parties have probably done it. Like just in talking to people that have lived and been involved in politics for a long time, it's really interesting to hear the stories that I've heard from years ago. And so I think it's something that we actually should investigate as far as making sure that everyone feels like when they go to the polls, it's worth them going to the polls because their vote's going to get counted the right way. And so I actually think that we probably have a lot of irregularities and probably fraud every single election, and that should never happen in America. When we can use the word democracy or republic, either way, we're talking about people electing their officials. And so anyone that, cares about voting would care about it being counted properly and there being the right controls in place to make sure that the people are electing their officials.
So I'd like to touch a bit on foreign policy. So a lot of people here at Duke, they've been pretty vocal about their varying stance on the Israel-Palestine issue, especially over the past year. What is your stance on the Israel-Palestine conflict?
I don't have a strong opinion. All I know is really there was, this peace in the Middle East. It's kind of another slogan under Donald Trump. And so I think the goals should be peace. I mean, that really should be our goal all the time between Taiwan and China, between Russia and Ukraine. We should always be advocating for peace at every single circumstance. So I don't ever want to say I support Palestine or Israel over either of the two. I care about all of those people that are in both of those countries. And so I don't have a strong opinion on, I'm not going to take a side. And a lot of people in my district are of Palestinian descent or Israeli descent, and there's even a lot of conflict here amongst those people, and I think that's really sad. Because really we most of the time are talking about two governments that are fighting each other, and the people are the ones who suffer. And so my goal would just always be peace between those people.
Would you support then withdrawing aid from Israel, or because right now the government is giving billions of dollars to Israel every year? Would you
I think that
scaling
what's
back?
interesting about that question is it's the same thing of like, would you give money to Ukraine? My answers to both of those is I want to go find out where it's going and how it's being used and who's it helping. And I don't think we have a lot of congressional oversight of money spending in any circumstance. Like when we look at any money spending, even within the U.S., like how much money, like where's our Social Security money? Is the Medicaid and Medicare funding going directly, like how is it being spent? And I think that when we're spending money at the federal level, we're spending taxpayers' dollars. So our taxpayers' dollars going to Israel should say like, well, how is it being spent and is it preventing conflict? Is it preventing problems happening here? Are we kind of fighting terrorism in a like low-key kind of way? Are there people that we're worried about them attacking us in America, and that's why we're spending the money? I would like to know those things, and I'd like to be very transparent. And I know there's some things when you're in the government you can't just give to everybody. But I think there's probably more things they could give us that they don't. And we have an information war right now where most people on either side, Republicans or Democrats, don't feel like they know what's true anymore. So when you quote that about Israel, I'm sure that is true about the amount of money going, but I'd be curious what it's being spent on, and I'd be curious who it's going to and what's the benefit of it. So that's more where I stand on. I'd want to be elected and go find out what it is, and then report that back to my constituents and say why I support it or why I don't support it, because right now I don't think we have enough information.
Okay. Well, the last thing I want to touch on is healthcare, which is especially fitting given your experience as a nurse. So U.S. spending per person in healthcare is thousands of dollars higher than other developed nations. Why do you think that is, and what should Congress do about that?
Yeah, it is a lot, and I think one of the hugest, that's not really a word, isn't it? Biggest problems with healthcare is lack of transparency. It's the same problem I just talked about when it came to spending on other situations. So I would, as much as I don't like this tactic, I think it helps the people, again, kind of figuring out how do you make it where the people are the ones with the power. And so when it comes to Medicaid and Medicare spending, I would like to see the federal government say if hospitals or healthcare facilities are receiving Medicaid, Medicare, VA, any sort of federal funds for healthcare, that they would be required to publicly post their prices. Because what we're seeing is there's a lot of middle people. This is interesting being in the hospital. I see where there's all these in-betweens. It's not the manufacturer with the product that goes directly to the hospital. There's all these people in between those people that a lot of times they're the ones that are increasing the prices. And so is that a regulation that Medicaid and Medicare or other insurances are imposing on hospital systems related to billing, that they have to have that extra check in there? So for instance, pharmaceuticals has this thing called PBMs. It's something I've learned. Again, I've done a lot of listening in the past year while I'm campaigning, and I've been really demonizing the pharmaceutical industry like a lot of people have lately. But I just learned, and I've talked to multiple people in pharmacy, that the pharmaceutical company may say price a drug at $30 a month, and then it goes through the PBM, and a lot of times they're offshore, so they're not paying taxes, they're not even paying into our system, and they're jacking the price up to say $200 a month, and that's what we're paying as the consumer, is the $200 a month. which that's a huge problem when it comes to pharmaceutical pricing, and I've heard that from multiple people in pharmacy. And so how do we get rid of that middleman and bring that price down to the people that is actually how it should be from the pharmaceutical company? How do we create a direct-to-consumer marketplace? So that's one thing I would be working on. I think your point is that it's higher pricing. I think what we see in America, and it has to do with us not having a universal healthcare system, and there's pros and cons to that. The pro is it probably does decrease some of the price, but it also will inevitably decrease quality. And so when I look at things, I look at each moving part and think, how can, just like a CEO of a hospital should look at every moving part and think, it's the same thing, but on a higher level. It's like, what are the moving parts that are increasing the price? For a CEO looking at my job, it's like, oh, if we take away an IV team, the person that's the expert in IVs, i.e. me at this point, if I walk in and I use one packet for, all of these IV supplies, but you send in 8 newbies before me and they all open 3 packages each, how much money have we lost just by looking at that decision being made from high above? It's the same application to the federal government. What is the process between the federal government paying money and the consumer, the patient receiving that care? And there are so much extra things going on right now that are unnecessary. And so as a congresswoman, I would want to go in and figure out, can we get rid of PBMs? Can we make pricing transparent where hospital administrators are not jacking up the price at one location and it being cheaper at another location? It should be a general similar reimbursement cost for every single hospital system in America. Now, you're going to have some exceptions. If you have a very high specialist neurosurgeon at Duke, well, everyone knows they're a high specialist neurosurgeon at Duke, so they're going to naturally be willing to pay more for that person. But that should also not interact with someone who's, say, on Medicaid versus Blue Cross Blue Shield being able to have access to that neurosurgeon. But there just needs to be transparency in healthcare, and I think that will decrease costs.
Okay, well, that's all I have for you today. Thank you again for joining.
Yeah, absolutely.
And for the video, Courtney Geels will be on the ballot this November, and she, again, is the Republican nominee for Congress in North Carolina's 4th District. So if you are voting in Durham, you will see her on the ballot. Thank you.
Thank you.